Mhm. Okay, and since we're here talking about scientific facts on the one hand and on the other hand about moral values, do you agree with the position that we can't really derive an ought from an is?
Well, the short answer is no. I'm not. So you're asking me if I subscribe to the naturalistic fallacy or to what some people call Hume's guillotine. So it's
Mhm.
the guillotine of David Hume. So yes, this is a point of tension within ethics and within evolutionary ethics in particular. For a long time, um, every time someone tried to come up with normative statements based on facts, the advocates of Hume's guillotine would claim that it's not possible to derive values from facts. Uh, I think that this is a less popular position now. Although it is possible to talk about a distinction between facts and values, to claim that it is not possible to go from one to another, or that it is not possible at all, I think it is going too far. Apparently, even David Hume did not say that we cannot go from is to ought. He was more subtle. He said that we should not assume that just because something is, that it should be. But, and that if you want to justify morality on the basis of facts, you cannot simply assume that one derives from the other. It has to be justified. You have to engage in better arguments in order to justify why you can reach one coming from another. And I think that facts influence our values every single day. So even though Jonathan Haidt says that morality binds and blinds, which means we tend to reject evidence because that violates our sacred beliefs, and we want to be connected to our own group. And if we start to question those beliefs, then we can no longer mobilize so well in that group, and that hurts the group, that hurts our sense of identity, and so forth. So even though Jonathan Haidt correctly, I think, says that morality binds and blinds, um, uh, if I suddenly know for a fact that something will hurt me, I am more likely to change my positive idea of it. So if Ricardo tells me X is dangerous, something is dangerous, well, of course I can ignore you, but if I respect your idea to a certain degree, I will begin to rethink my normative behavior in relation to this thing that Ricardo tells me is dangerous, right? So I will not, I will somehow rethink my values on the basis of a fact. So, um, uh, and I think we do this all the time with objects, with people. When facts change, people change their minds about things, and they also then change their minds about how to deal with those things, which affects, of course, normativity, values, etc. And I also think that ultimately values always assume some facts, which is evidence that there is no absolute dichotomy between the two. And this is also why I am sympathetic towards functionalist approaches to normative ethics. So, in other words, as Aristotle would put it, first ask what that thing does, and then you'll start to understand what that thing should be doing, or what we should do with that thing. So I do think that this is still a good starting point.
Mhm. Okay. And I mean, the naturalistic fallacy, should we really call it a fallacy? Because, I mean, of course, when people are discussing ethics or morality, and when they're specifically discussing some very contentious topics, like, for example, I don't know, abortion or something like that, there are people who for the sake of the debate or to win the debate, they say that if the other person is saying that something is good as it is, because they are saying, oh, this is like this, so if naturally it works like this, then it's good as it is. And then people say, oh, that's not a valid argument because you're making the naturalistic fallacy or something like that. But on the other hand, I guess that all of us do it, because I mean, sexists do it with differences between men and women. Racists do it with differences between races. But even people who are more liberal-minded, they also do it when, for example, trying to make a case for homosexuals, because the core of their argument there is that they are born that way, that is, their sexual orientation is innate, and so it is not bad for them to be homosexual or whatever. So, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to ask you is, should we really call it a fallacy when virtually all people, at least when it comes to certain topics, use this sort of reasoning or argumentation?
Right. I don't think it is a fallacy at all. I think it's a constitutive part of how we reason about reality and how reality influences us. Yes, you're right. Everybody does it, and I think that we cannot simply move away from it. The reason, I think, the reason why people are so opposed to, or at least some people are so opposed to research on human differences, whether at the racial level or sexual, any differences between humans, tends to receive some resistance. And I do think that the reason is that we are not convinced that it's possible to discover facts and then values remain insensitive to facts, right? That facts will not influence us at all. I don't think that this is how. I think that what is behind all this resistance to studying human differences. What is behind this is precisely this feeling that facts change values. and so we don't want certain facts, because of course there are people then that, to try to calm the conversation down, they say, but look, these are just facts, values remain as they are. Fair enough, and it's an interesting rhetorical point, but I don't think that many people are convinced by it. Because I don't think that that's how we actually reason about values and facts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, and since now we're talking about this, and since you are a philosopher, I would like to ask you if you notice that you yourself, or perhaps other colleagues of yours, get some sort of backlash from colleagues and students and even other people when you try to apply evolutionary theory, because we're talking about innate aspects of the human mind here, to topics like politics and ethics, and also if you think that postmodernism is prevalent in philosophy or not.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I guess it's. I can only speak for myself, so I don't have data with me in order to speak for the academia in general. I was in Great Britain, so I know parts of British academia, and I know the Portuguese academia, which is where I am at the moment. So yes, in my field, I do think that postmodernism is not dominant. It's not dominant in philosophy. Philosophy is often accused of being a quite conservative discipline because it has such a large canon that you must study. But yes, but certain subfields are quite ideological and sometimes quite hostile to scientific, just simple naturalistic thinking, scientific thinking.
And what would be some of those fields?
Yeah, I also don't don't want to be too specific because I would need data to do that. Mm-hmm. But I guess that it's easier to find these approaches in perhaps sociology departments, perhaps literature departments. So all fields that are more connected to language that tend to belong to what some people call the linguistic turn, where language is a vital force of how we see the world, and everything or most things are seen through that perspective. So some of those people actually have issues with scientific approaches to social phenomena. Yes, but so especially here in Portugal, this type of approach is not very common in the humanities. But to be fair, it's also not mainstream in this case in Great Britain, for example. You can find more people interested in it. Obviously, it's also a bigger it's also a bigger realm. But I would say that applying evolutionary reasoning to politics and ethics, especially politics, remains somehow underdeveloped. So hopefully this will change.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now just for the last part of the interview, I would like to ask you specifically about more specific topics of your work, because I know that you've done work on the thinking of Friedrich Hayek and Karl Polanyi and others, and while referring to their ideas about market liberal morality, and you also talk a little bit there about how and why perhaps they were making a case on the basis of evolutionary thinking or something like that. But first, I would like to ask you, what are their claims, the ones that you analyze in your work when it comes to the ways market liberal morality works?
Right. Yeah. So my current work focuses on understanding the evolutionary consequences of liberal morality, and in particular of market liberal morality. And so I got quite interested in Hayek, also Polanyi, but in particular Hayek, because Hayek was a true evolutionary thinker. He was into group selection when group selection was not fashionable, so perhaps I should somehow try to introduce Hayek a little bit here for those that don't know who Hayek is. So Hayek was an economist and political philosopher. He won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1974. And he is famous for making a defense of classical liberalism, free market, the minimal state, the rule of law, individual freedom, etc., etc. And he distinguished himself, among other aspects, by making the defense of classical liberalism on the basis of evolutionary theory. So this was a central reason why I got interested in his work, because he was defending liberal market morality on the basis of evolution, and this was what I was interested in. I wanted to understand how sustainable is our moral and political paradigm from an evolutionary perspective. So I was interested in posing these big questions, and so I discovered Hayek, and Hayek was already tackling these questions from an evolutionary perspective, and I thought, okay, then I'm going to start from Hayek, and then I will develop my own views on the subject. So, based on group selection, Hayek explains the evolutionary superiority of economic liberalism and liberal morality by arguing that the social groups that adopt a market morality will be selected in the natural selection process at the expense of groups with tribal moralities. So, in other words, tribal moralities do not really work at the evolutionary level. They are maladaptive, and what actually works, or what works better, is a market liberal morality, because that is what is adaptive. And I will already try to explain what he means by that. So Hayek thought that there are two big systems of morality in nature. He understands one is the tribal morality, which means that we have instincts for group altruism, which is the evolutionary legacy of living as hunter-gatherers for thousands of years. And so we have these inbuilt tribal instincts that we cannot run away from very easily. But on the other hand, we developed what he calls a market morality, or the Great Society morality. And this is based on an extended cooperation via markets, private property, and this morality is individualistic and impersonal, right, as we want it to be from a market perspective. So for Hayek, we were civilized in the market against our wishes. So essentially what he says is nobody likes the market. Nobody likes free market. It is somehow, actually goes against our tribal instincts. But he says we were civilized in the market because the groups that adopted this market morality managed to reproduce more and increase their numbers. So essentially, it was a process of cultural and moral group selection. Those that adhered to a market morality simply expanded, right? Simply grew, and this is why we have it, even though we don't like it. He says, even though we don't like it, but that's the way it is. We have to live with it, he says. So for Hayek, we must not have common objectives as groups. So because he says tribal morality condemns millions to death. That is, tribal morality cannot generate material conditions for reproductive expansion due to epistemic problems. This has to do with his broader theory that is a theory of knowledge theory, an epistemic theory, where he argues that central planning and group-oriented institutions do not really work because we don't know how to produce wealth. We don't know how people can actually satisfy their preferences under that system. And so it is through the market, it is through the price system that people actually have these tacit signals that they can use to satisfy preferences in the market. So to produce more of this, produce less of this, consume more of this, etc., etc. And this is how people coordinate their actions. And the market is the best way to do that, he says, because we don't have enough knowledge to do that in a tribal system, in a system that is more centralized and has group goals, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So Karl Polanyi appears in this story not because he was an evolutionary theorist. He was not. He was an economic historian and social theorist, but he came to the opposite conclusion of Hayek. He concluded that the free market, unlike what Hayek says, the free market would destroy community life, would destroy culture, would destroy traditions, and with this destruction, life itself would be destroyed, which means people would stop reproducing. Even they would not even have the will to reproduce after a certain point, at least until this market liberal morality is eliminated. So we have these two authors, Hayek in particular, because he was a very evolutionary thinker. In my work, I am critical of Hayek's position. So I don't know if you had the opportunity to read my position on the topic, but my position is that liberal morality is adaptive for groups. That tribal morality is more adaptive for groups than liberal market morality. So I argue that this liberal morality is not adaptive in the long run. And so I can present several arguments to justify my position, which is what I do in my paper, Is Market Liberalism Adaptive? From 2017. So first of all, there is what I call the challenge of demography, right? So population growth is actually happening in continents where market institutions are of poor quality. The societies with the best market institutions, as we know, show birth rates below replacement levels. That is, so according to their reproductive indicators, they tend towards extinction if this trend is not reversed in any way. So they will go extinct, right? But there is abundant evidence that markets have a negative impact on birth rates in the Western world, but they also show this effect in non-Western countries such as Japan, Brazil, India. So there is a strong correlation between the introduction of free markets and birth rates, and the collapse of birth rates. Mm-hmm. So the general picture tells us that the developing world accounts for 98% of the world population growth. So, and this seems somehow strange. It doesn't seem to fit in very well with Hayek's idea that a market liberal morality expands the populations, and it's quite adaptive because people can have more children and so forth. But of course, I think that Hayek was highly influenced by the event of the Industrial Revolution, because the phenomenon of the Industrial Revolution and the subsequent population explosion in Europe and their diaspora, that the Europeans spread throughout the most continents. So it seems to confirm Hayek's theory. However, my explanation is different. I think that what happened was that material abundance was generated, but the traditional morality was still present. So that's why we had the demographic explosion. So there was still a prestige of large families. It was still an important point for a man to have a large family, to appreciate that as one of the highest goals in life. But when the liberal values began to be internalized, then the birth rate fell to the sub-replacement levels that we observe today. So what happened, we may ask? I don't know if you want to intervene. I don't want to speak. Now I'm trying to explain it. So if you have something, if you want to intervene.
No. I was just letting you finish because I already have 2 points that I want to explore. Okay. But please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So what happened? What happened for us to have these birth rates and for us to to come to the state of affairs we are now in. So as cultural evolutionists Boyd and Richardson have identified, modern societies promote the evolution of selfish characteristics. So individualistic, perhaps hedonistic, but what is important is that professional prestige and status are these days measured at the individual level, not at the family level, the lineage, the clan, etc. So social success is now seen as an individual phenomenon. So people usually ask, so that person is quite successful in life because it did this and that. And they are less likely to ask, but how many kids does that person have, right? So asking in the sense that, oh, if that person doesn't have many kids, I already don't think that person is very important. And this means that market liberal morality has risen to the level of meta-morality. So now what we understand to be important in life is measured mostly at an individualistic level. And so I ask, so is this liberal satisfaction of preferences maladaptive? And I do think so. So I argue that Hayek did not understand the consequences of the liberal satisfaction of preferences, because the satisfaction of liberal preferences, or the liberal satisfaction of preferences, means to discover everything beyond reproduction, everything beyond adaptiveness or fitness. For example, having children, large families, caring for the tribe, culture, or lineage. This has become just as morally valid as having professional success, going on vacations, having extravagant hobbies. And so morality now is loose to that, is individualistic to that extent. It no longer asks for people to care about collective aims at the evolutionary level, but simply to be good professionals and to satisfy their preferences in whatever way it is. So there is no punishment for the satisfaction of preferences that is not adaptive, right? Mm-hmm. And this takes us to the importance of moral framing, the moral framing of preferences. I think that Hayek did not properly understand the importance of the collective or tribal moral framework. Because, as we know, morality can be adaptive or maladaptive. I usually give this example of how, it's a quite radical example, but it's an example of how morality can be maladaptive. For example, let's imagine a religious sect that comes to the conclusion that sex and reproduction are moral sins. So they come together and they live together, they truly believe in this sin. So what happens with this morality? Well, it will last for one generation, right? This morality will simply die the moment that sect ends. So it lasts for one generation. So morality is under selection. So if we believe in wrong things, we are more likely to come up with moralities that are not adaptive. So the function of the tribal morality, I claim that the function of this tribal morality, or this tribal moral framing, is to direct the preferences of groups towards adaptive behavior. And we have good evidence of this, as we learned from the experiences of behavioral economists like Daniel Kahneman and Richard Thaler. Preferences are largely set by context, by elites, by institutions, and paternalism is largely inevitable. And this process is solidified by the general conformism in relation to the culture, morality, and institutions. So people tend to look at others that are successful, that have power, that have prestige, and they tend to be conformist. They tend to imitate them and to do what they are doing. Hayek, I think he thought that the growth of material conditions, so the market creates material conditions, and this would allow for more children. And the desire to reproduce would not be affected by the market process and by a market liberal morality. But the preference for high reproduction is also shaped by the incentives given by the institutions, group morality, and the moral framing of the elites. So if elites have a morality that says what is important, what is moral, is to satisfy your own preferences, and without specifying which preferences those are, people will simply engage in many preferences that are not adaptive, right? So this is what I think this is what we are seeing in the Western world. And at a global level, we can observe that more religious and non-liberal societies expand their numbers, and that secular societies cannot even reach 2.1 children per woman to perpetuate themselves over time. I usually give an example of the Amish. The Amish in the US are a paradigmatic case because they duplicate their numbers each passing generation. With its subculture and strict non-liberal morality, they expel those that cannot live under those rules and thus select individuals with pro-group characteristics. So this is how culture and morality help to select biological characteristics, or at least it is a process among others. So it is a process called gene-culture coevolution. And so this brings us to the importance of tribal goals, of a tribal morality. I think that individualistic market morality does not give cohesion to groups. So it demoralizes individuals, even for reproduction, as Karl Polanyi would say, and it cannot transform them into adaptive social groups, so not capable of outperforming other groups in terms of evolution. So I side with Karl Polanyi here. I think that markets need to be embedded in meta-moralities and meta-cultures that cannot be based on a liberal market morality. These meta-morals must be group-oriented society that is tribal. So they must have specific group goals and identity goals. And in order to be adaptive, these meta-moralities have to counteract the market tendency towards social atomization and group demoralization. We can find also evidence of this in Jonathan Haidt's moral foundation theories. So his empirical tests on moral foundations, as we know, show their empirical tests on moral foundations show that liberal morality uses only 3 of 6 possible moral foundations, right? So liberalism only upholds freedom, care, and fairness, but it is unable to realize the importance of foundations such as authority, loyalty, and purity or sanctity. And these foundations, I claim, are important for groups to operate as adaptive units in the process of group selection. But liberalism is unable to use them because it argues that the political sphere should not promote any notion of the good life. So this is part of the liberal ethos that politics should not be engaged in promoting any particular notion of the good life. So I will let you now intervene because I'm a lot of time.
No, but I let you speak until the end because it was really interesting, and that way you were able to put out all of the ideas that were associated with the work of Friedrich Hayek and Polanyi and others. But now, okay, 2 things. The first one, I guess it's simpler. So I think that you're right when you point to the fact that Hayek was wrong when he said that market liberal morality is more adaptive due to the reasons that you exposed, namely the fact that birth rates plummeted or tend to decrease drastically in countries that adopt this kind of market society and market liberal morality and things like that. Okay, so I think that from a strictly biological evolutionary perspective, that's right. But and now it's the part where this gets a bit tricky, because when it comes to morality, it seems to me at least that there are two big points here. The first one is that, okay, with liberal markets, we get people get less groupish, let's say, less tribal. And that by itself, at least for me, would already seem a positive thing, because there is a lot of violence and conflict that is promoted via groups. That is one group of people going against the other. And so if that's right, then if we are diminishing tribalism, then that would also go down. And I mean, looking at the work done by Steven Pinker, documenting how society, morality, and etc. progressed over the last 200 years or so with the advent of the Industrial Revolution and capitalism as we have it nowadays, and all that followed that, it seems to me that one of the aspects we could point toward is the fact that intergroup conflict, for example, armed conflict between countries, has really decreased over time, particularly from 1946 forward. And also all levels of violence and criminality, they have also decreased over time. But and on the other hand, it seems to me that overall there is an increasing number of people worldwide that really benefit from this economic and social approach, because even if people, when they act as economic agents, they are doing so in a selfish basis, the fact is that collectively we are able to produce so much good and evolve economically, have much higher economic growth and things like that, that even if we as individuals don't care about it, it seems that it expands little by little to involve more and more people around the world, and those people are lift up from their dire conditions into a better place in society and have increasingly better life conditions and things like that. So, I mean, from a moral standpoint, it seems that even if we don't want to, we are contributing to more and more people having better and better lives. So I don't know if that makes sense, but
yes, I guess that yes, that's true. That's true. I agree that markets and what we may call a liberal market morality has contributed to the increase in wealth all over the world, and this is present in how the world is reproducing. So, of course, if this is a good thing or a bad thing, according to our standards of morality, right? So I guess what Ricardo was saying is that from a liberal perspective, this is a good thing, right? So from a liberal perspective, that sort of diminishes group goals and group interests and or even group evolutionary interests. So if we put that on the side then from a liberal perspective, this is working quite well, because it seems to be irrelevant who it benefits, if it benefits group X or group Y. But the problem is that I don't think that morality works exactly like that. I think that of course, morality binds and blinds, and so we are more likely to think that that what is good for us is good universally. So, but the fact is that all over the world there are many people that are not satisfied with the liberal order, that are not happy with the results that came out of this system, and precisely because they have different moral systems. We cannot talk about one big moral system in the world. We can only speak about several moral systems. And from the perspective of group selection, then these moral systems are in competition. And the gold standard of this competition is reproductive fitness, right? So if we ask, so is this morality sustainable then? We may come to the conclusion by observing the reproductive patterns of several groups that those where market liberalism and in particular liberal morality is very strong are the ones that are being selected against. And by using logic, we think, okay, then we may very well be good liberals and think that this is a good thing. But the question is a different one here. Is it sustainable? Does it really have a future if we understand these trends as they are, and if we understand that morality is tightly connected to reproductive fitness? So of course, we also have results from evolutionary game theory that show quite well that so these models, these simulation models, evolutionary simulation models, they try to identify the most adaptive strategies of cooperation, and they have consistently revealed that in-group favoritism or ethnocentrism is a strategy that beats cooperative universalism in the long run. So, of course, these are models that have specific parameters, and we can always object that, well, if we change the parameters, perhaps we come to different conclusions. But I do think that these models are very much in line with what we observe in the world, with the picture that I try to present in my paper. So I think that our challenge in the 21st century is not to abolish tribalism, but to learn how to use it in the best way possible, in sustainable ways. So in my future work, I hope to provide some good ideas on how to do that, because as you put it, it's not easy, because the moment you allow for identity, for tribalism, for a certain emphasis on the group, conflicts may arise. But I don't think that from everything that we know, that to abolish group identities and to abolish tribalism can be sustainable in any way. So we have to think in different terms now, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me just add one more point that just came to my mind now, because earlier I was talking about Steven Pinker's work, but we could also refer here to Hans Rosling and people at Gapminder and Max Roser, and Our World in Data and projects like that are very interesting, because it seems to me that one result that they all get is that as people live in more affluent societies, and as those societies get richer and richer, and people live in better conditions and have access to more and more goods and wealth, it's one result that they always obtain is that because people are freed from certain things like having to look for shelter and food and water and other basic biological stuff like that, even though from a strictly market liberal economical standpoint they seem to be more selfish, they also are liberated to be preoccupied with other stuff like the environment and how people in other countries are living, and if they have good or bad conditions, and also to give some monetary aid to them and things like that. So even there, perhaps the fact that we lose our sense of group identity, I mean, perhaps it is not that straightforward, because it seems that people also tend to expand the groups of people they think of, or at least they are partially worried about. So what do you think about that?
Right. You're right. So group identities change. We very often expand our circles of altruism. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that the idea that you can expand it without an end is a quite weak idea. Of course, we can go from smaller tribes to bigger tribes. Our identities may change because it incorporates more people. But ultimately, I don't think that we can actually, in order for us to have a sustainable, in order to have sustainable institutions and standards of morality, we need to embrace some form of tribalism. It doesn't have to be small; it can be larger. But I do think that to think that it can be stretched without limits, just in this universal fashion, is not sustainable. And I think that we are beginning to see some backlashes of this. And once again, we are now in a good position to understand why these things happen. We understand it quite well. So, because we cannot, in my opinion, because we cannot erase tribalism, we have to learn to deal with it in the best way possible. And hopefully we can build something better from that. And something realistic.
Okay, good. So let's end the interview here, Dr. Nobre Faria. But before we go, apart from your papers and your faculty page that I will be leaving in the description box of this video, would you like to tell people perhaps other sources that they might like to get in contact with from the internet, or even books or any stuff like that?
Ooh, that's a good question. There are so many things. Well, I guess that I could say that they can go to my Twitter account. I usually share several articles and books and important information on these topics. I don't make many comments there. But I share interesting material that will certainly be of interest to people that like evolution and politics and philosophy, so the whole 9 yards. So please go there.
Okay, I will include that in the description box. So, Dr. Nobre Faria, again, it was really a pleasure to have you on the show, and thank you a lot for taking the time to be here with us today.
Thank you very much. And let me just end with this note. I think that you are doing a great job. This is an extremely important job. And well, if we can, if we are allowed to be somehow patriotic or tribalism, I would say I'm happy that a Portuguese person has this idea and is actually presenting such good work. So thank you very much for your work.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the kind words. Hi everybody, thank you for coming to my channel and for watching this interview until the end. I've started this channel in February 2018, and so I've been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields, and I would really like to ask you just to consider visiting my Patreon page and making a pledge there. Any amount, even $1, would already be a great help. And so otherwise, if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons: KARIN, LIETZCKE, and BLANCHETTE, Per HELGE LARSEN, Lau GUERREIRO, CHANTEL GELINAS, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunde, and Brian Rivera. Thank you for all.